Now, according to the Turkish President Erdogan, that he said, and I quote, "The war is Benjamin Netanyahu's survival battle, but the cost, it's global. As a matter of fact, the whole world is paying the price," end quote. Now, he believed that Iran has stopped the gas export to Turkey, adding to energy pressure not only to the nation of Turkey, but also globally. But looking around, and how do we understand the reaction, especially from some of the countries in Europe? And for example, based on the recent statement from the British Prime Minister, declared that Britain does not believe, and I quote, "regime change from the skies." Spanish Prime Minister barred the US from using the base as the war continues. Last but not least, even though Germany has not stopped the US from using the base, but it has made clear you will not have the US in other ways. How do we understand that? And I'm sure that at this moment we should and we ought to ask the question, what is the outcome of the war for US, and also what about the reaction from the NATO allies? Sitting US President Donald Trump has been very outspoken and straightforward, especially when it comes to criticizing the NATO allies, and believe that it's time for US to take a bold stand towards those allies, or so far we still call them allies, but we don't know how things will change. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to invite our distinguished speaker, who is the Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Professor Choksy is a distinguished professor. He's the former chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, the former chair of the Department of Central Eurasia Studies, and the current director of the Inner Asia and Uralic National Resource Center at Indiana University at Bloomington. Well, Professor Choksy, and welcome back to The Missing Piece.
Thank you, Will.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, as I mentioned in the intro, we are seeing this mixed reaction from the NATO allies. Again, some of the countries that I listed, for example, Britain, Spain, Germany, and also we heard the voice and also the strong statement from the Turkish president. Professor Choksy, from your perspective, what do you make of those reactions from the NATO allies? And of course, Donald Trump, it's not happy about what he's reading and also the conversation with all of them. It looks like U.S. could be alone in this war without much larger support from the NATO members. Let's start with your thoughts.
The unfortunate situation is that this arises from what happened between Donald Trump and the European countries during his first term in office and now during his second presidential term. He made it clear that he regarded them as second-rate allies. He threatened to go into a NATO country, Greenland, by force, completely unnecessary. So the consequences are now when you'd expect those allies to stand with the United States, we find that they're not doing so. One can, of course, also take the position that from the viewpoint of the Europeans, the oil and gas that comes out of the Straits of Hormuz is less important. Europe does not get most of its oil from there. In fact, the United States doesn't either. It is Asia that really needs gas and oil from the Straits of Hormuz. However, I would argue that the decision by these NATO countries is also short-sighted. Because when they next need the United States, particularly if Russia makes a move beyond Ukraine in the next 2.5 years, you're going to find Donald Trump playing hard to get in terms of providing American support to the Europeans. So I think that the Europeans should have thought perhaps a little beyond Donald Trump and his reactions and agreed to play a role, if not for themselves, if not for Donald Trump, to help end the war quickly, to help open the Straits of Hormuz, to help stabilize global markets. And when we talk about the Straits of Hormuz, of course, all our attention goes to oil and gas.
That's right.
But we forget that petrochemicals also provide a very substantial number of other elements that we use on a day-to-day basis. So physics labs around the world use helium. Qatar is the largest producer of helium in the world. That's just one example. There are all these other fertilizers, etc. And let me throw in something else that most of your viewers may not think about. Every single country of the Persian Gulf, including Iran, imports massive amounts of food. Iran imports only about 30%, but it is basic food commodities: rice, tea, sugar. Places like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates import between 90 to 98% of all food consumed there. So the consequences of shutting the Straits of Hormuz are far greater than merely petrochemicals. It's one of these choke points of the world, you know. Gulf of Aden is the other. There are a few of these, you know, this Malacca Straits. There are a few of these choke points through which items, people, goods flow. And that's why opening the Straits of Hormuz, whether by force or by negotiations, is very important.
Professor Choksy, I'm very glad that you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz, which related to our next question. Now, again, based on the latest report or the reliable source, recently, under the urgency of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, now, many countries, for example, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada, released a joint statement condemning, and quote, the de facto closure of the Strait of Hormuz by the Iranian forces and expressing their readiness to contribute to appropriate effort to ensure safe passage through the strait, end quote. Professor Choksy, we understand, as you mentioned before, the Strait of Hormuz, it's beyond this economic factor. But another thing we need to think about is when we look at those countries, Britain, France, and Germany, Italy, those are the European countries. And what about Japan? You know, Canada, Canada is the borderline with America, but Japan, it's a reliable partner on the Asian side for the US. So based on your expertise, that number one, it's one thing to condemn that the Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz, but it's something else that to say, we don't believe this is a good idea, but meanwhile, for the US, we can't really help you much because we have our own domestic concerns. And also, this is not the effort that you call joint effort at this moment. So how do you make of that? Because I think for Donald Trump, and if I'm not mistaken, he sees those countries as a betrayal. You know, so perhaps next time that Donald Trump is not going to play the game fairly anymore. But meanwhile, those countries will say, only this time, but maybe next time. What do you get? What are you getting?
So that's the interesting part. Again, when we talk about the closure, what we are talking about here is the Iranians have not attacked ships bringing food into the countries so far. So entering the Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, they have been attacking some oil tankers leaving. And the main threat so far does not appear to be mines. It appears to be aerial attacks via missiles. So the question that remains is, how does the straits get opened? The position the United States has been taken, the tactic that has been taken so far, is to essentially attack and destroy degrade Iran's capability to launch drones and missiles, and also to attack ships, Iranian vessels in the region that could possibly lay mines or release drones. So there is a degradation strategy the United States is taking to eventually open the straits. The problem is, of course, the United States, as has happened previously. You remember that there was the war of tankers some years ago. And so would to ensure absolute safe passage would also have to check for mines and demine the straits, and then provide safe passage as well. So it is complicated. It is very easy to close, harder to keep open. But one can also, I think, at this point, throw in the other countries of the Persian Gulf region as well. They are taking a hammering from Iran. So far, none of them has attacked Iran back. The question is, at what point do those countries say enough is enough? Granted that we have US bases here that the US uses, but it's not like we have the capability of pushing the United States out. And also, they have pointed out that Iran is attacking civilian targets in those countries. Those countries are not officially part of the war. They're not providing they may be providing some degree of logistics, but they're not providing aircraft or troops. So I think the question remains how quickly the United States and Israel can degrade Iran's capability to continue closing the strait, and how quickly the other countries of the Persian Gulf also decide to get involved.
Professor Choksy, I want to move our conversation to a larger picture. Again, right now, we are paying closer attention to the war between US and Iran. But meanwhile, we're also paying much closer, should we say, even getting to the point that people still remember the war in Ukraine. You remember, US also is playing a role at this moment. So in other words, Donald Trump has now abandoned his promise to help with Ukraine and also to end the war as soon as possible. But one really begs the question about this confusion of the US global strategy. I remember back in the days that when we talk about the Iraq war, and also we talk about the war in Afghanistan under former President Joe Biden, the experts within the international community kept on saying there has to be, or US is expected to show a clear picture about what they called international and national security strategy. But when we are looking at the war between US and Iran at this moment, more people believe, came as a very shocking news to me, might not be a surprise to you, Professor Choksy, is it doesn't look like US is winning despite what Donald Trump has posted on social media. But the winner of the war, it's actually Russia. So Russia, it's gaining a lot more advantages in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the confusion. So Professor Choksy, from your perspective, I gotta ask the question, if US is all winning, is Russia taking the advantage at this moment? And if so, what about Iran? Is there another secret deal between Iran and Russia at this moment that US government doesn't know yet? What do you think of that?
And that's an interesting question, because certainly American resources are being diverted from the war in Ukraine to the Persian Gulf. Let's keep in mind, however, European resources have not been diverted away from Ukraine. To the extent that they were there, they continue to be there. But the other interesting factor, Will, is that Ukraine's own attention is sort of diverted because the war with Russia has turned Ukraine into one of the world's experts in countering drone attacks. And now we know that Ukraine has sent drone specialists to the Persian Gulf countries to help advise on anti-drone strategy, because the Iranians and the Russians, together with Ukrainians, are some of the experts in the world in drone technology and drone military technology specifically. So there's this sort of interesting flow, shall we say, of aspects of the war back and forth, where you now have Ukraine, in a sense, also involved in the Persian Gulf War, assisting the United States and assisting the Persian Gulf countries, the Arab countries, clearly hoping that in so doing, that Ukraine will benefit by financial funding from the Arab countries to sustain their war against Russia, and that they will generate goodwill with Donald Trump to assist against Russia. So there are all these, shall we say, moving parts coming together. On the other hand, the the Gulf War means that less of Iranian drones are available to Russia. So the entire picture is getting more complicated. Less Iranian resources for Russia, but also less Russian funds available to help support Iran. I'm not sure whether there are net gains or losses on either side. The but clearly one can see how technologies and countries are, shall we say, involved on two fronts at the same time. Let us keep in mind that Russia has nuclear advisors at Iran's nuclear plants, and your viewers have probably heard and read that Russia is now withdrawing those advisors from Natanz and these other plants, nuclear plants in Iran, for the safety of the Russians. So Iran, on the at the same time, is also losing Russian knowledge that has contributed towards Iran's nuclear program.
Professor, let's keep our conversation going. Let's talk about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as our next conversation. Now, we know that when we look at the war, again, as I mentioned, the war in Ukraine and also the war between US and Iran at this moment, another key or critical concept that constantly comes to our mind is the military power. Again, based on the latest report, that President Trump believed there's an opportunity to leverage the tremendous achievement the U.S. has reached alongside with the Israeli military to realize the goal of the war through an agreement that will basically safeguard this vital interest between U.S. and Israel, end quote. Professor, I gotta ask, how much can we understand the military power, not from the US, but from the Israeli perspective? Because we know that today, when we talk about, again, despite what President Trump believes or, the messages that he's been posting on social media, but at some point, or even once, that he believed and claimed it was critical to put boots on the ground, we didn't really know what he meant. But at the beginning of the war, he promised that U.S. military would not show up in the nation of Iran. That was not the original goal. So again, going back to your point is, if the war continues, or as President Trump said, the war has completed or the war has won by the U.S., what about the military influence? And what about this part that the role of Israeli military power and also the U.S. military power? Who to believe? How do we balance that? What do you say to that?
I think what we are also seeing in, let's say, the last year or so is the expansion of Israel's military power across the Middle East. In taking, first beginning in Gaza, then into Lebanon with Hezbollah, attacking Hezbollah and Iranian assets in Syria, and now against now for the second time, for Israel, this is the second war with Iran. What I think we are seeing are two perspectives. One, from the Israeli point of view, whether we agree with it or not, there is a notion in Israel that Iran has become an existential threat to Israel. And in part, that is because of the constant daily threats by Iran against Israel, that Israel is going to be annihilated, etc., etc. And then, of course, against the United States as well. We've had more than 40 years of Iran supporting proxy attacks against American bases, against American citizens. Shall we say, in that sense, it reached a boiling point. And it's also clear that Donald Trump's aim is to ensure that Iran, as he puts it, never develops a nuclear weapon. That is also Israel's aim, that Iran, shall we say, even a broader aim, that Iran is never again a military threat to Israel. Now, in the long run, is that a possibility to be achieved? Perhaps not. Perhaps yes, with the prospect that if Iran were to return to developing a nuclear weapon, then Israel or the United States would have to take another whack at the program. I think where the difference between Israel and the United States, in terms of the military attacks and political goals, is that Israel truly would like to see regime change in Iran, because I think Israel understands the nuclear issue is only part of the problem. It is a question of who is in power. Because let us be honest here. Whatever tensions there may be between, let's say, the United States and China, and let's bring China into this, no one sits around being afraid that the United States and China are going to engage in a nuclear war. Okay? Generals may war game this because that's part of their duty, but it is not a realistic possibility because one sees that that's because of the regimes. And so I think from Israel's point of view, regime change is what they see as the ultimate off-ramp to ensuring that there is no attack against Israel, from a nuclear attack from Iran. For Donald Trump, I think the goals are, shall we say, narrow. And that's why we see him being willing to, on the one hand, talk about continuing attacks against Iran, and on the other hand, being willing to negotiate with the current regime in Iran. Even as that regime is getting decimated, even as leaders are getting killed, he's willing to negotiate. We currently have discussions where he's talking about the Iranian Speaker of Parliament, someone who would be completely unacceptable to the majority of Iranians. Sort of the same scenario as Venezuela. So in other words, regime stability. So I think we're also beginning to see differences in mission between the United States and Israel.
Well, Professor Choksy, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, as I mentioned, the war between US and Iran at this moment, it's not just about the two countries. Let's shift our attention to another critical country in Asia, which is North Korea. Now, based on the latest report, Kim Jong-un, the current North Korean leader, said Americans' attack on Iran justified his decision to expand his country's nuclear arsenal despite international sanctions, again, according to the state media. So, Professor Choksy, from your perspective, when we look at the reaction, when we think about this statement as Kim Jong-un, how do we understand that? So, in other words, does the war between US and Iran actually give a country like North Korea advantage of doing that? Go ahead.
Let's say that any war provides justification. So let us say Russia's movement into Ukraine can be used as justification by many European countries to say we should develop nuclear weapons. But we know that France and Britain, for example, are two nuclear powers. But on the other hand, one could say this could be used as a justification by Germany. So the regional wars can indeed be used as justification. The problem is, what does that accomplish? And I think what we need to be looking at what we need to be looking at is a reality that North Korea will continue to expand its nuclear arsenal, and that is going to, shall we say, be a flashpoint in the Korean Peninsula with Japan, and that's also going to be, shall we say, involve China to the extent to which China can perhaps try to control North Korean ambitions.
Well, Professor Choksy, let me just quickly add on another question. Again, Kim Jong-un, the current North Korean leader, during the speech that he did not mention Iran by name, but this is what he said, and again, it's pretty stunning, especially I want to get your reaction from this. This is what he said, and I quote, "Acts of terror and aggression that the U.S. is committing throughout the world, it's indeed terrifying." So in other words, the international community should pay closer attention to what's happening right now, especially that the threat poses by the U.S., end quote. Professor Choksy, from your perspective, what do you make of the statement? I mean, so in other words, we know that Kim Jong-un is not a big fan of Donald Trump, or Kim Jong-un might never be the big fan of Donald Trump, but it's saying that looks like by attacking Iran, according to Kim Jong-un, U.S. is committing acts of terror and aggression. What do you think of that?
Well, let us keep in mind that during Donald Trump's first term as president, the leader of North Korea and the president of the United States actually met on the DMZ.
That's right.
In a very remarkable scenario. So shall I say, I pay give less importance to the rhetoric coming out of North Korea because it is quite likely that the leader there would be willing to meet with the President of the United States again, while at the same time, as we know, North Korea on a regular basis fires off missiles into the region, not at other countries, but as constantly makes threats, whether it is against South Korea, against Japan, fires missiles into the region. So I would regard North Korea more as a destabilizing force. And shall we say, North Korea, the North Korean leadership marches to its own drum, which, as far as we can tell, is not even in the benefit of its own people. So I would regard that as a lot of rhetoric and certainly as justification by its leadership to expand its military power. The question there is it benefiting the North Korean people at all?
That's a great question. Of course, that's a question that every single person outside North Korea, especially the political scientists, is asking every day. It's what will happen to the regime? And also, again, just looking at what's happened in Iran, is the government's purpose or ambition actually bring changes, not just to the regime, to the leaders, but also to the people every day in this country. Well, again,
and I think we should end by saying that perhaps the best outcome back in Iran is that the people voice in how their destiny, their future evolves.
Well, again, Professor Choksy, everything that you mentioned indeed resonates with a lot of us, and also our viewers has a lot more to think. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's such an honor to speak to Professor Jamsheed Choksy. Again, Professor Choksy is an expert on international relationships, and of course, that he's expert on, especially the geopolitics in the Middle East, the nation of Iran, Qatar, and so forth. And I strongly encourage everyone to go online to connect with Professor Choksy. Well, again, sir, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. I would love to have you back on the show as we continue to pay attention to this matter and also the global affairs. So thank you so much for doing this.